Okay, we are here now on MedTech Innovator Live. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Grand. I'm the CEO here at MedTech Innovator. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live. So this is a weekly webinar series that we do during our accelerator. MedTech Innovator is an accelerator, but we're a little different than most accelerators. We are focused on companies that are a little bit further down the road. So companies that I like to refer to as downstream. In other words, we're not looking for people with ideas who want to start companies. We're looking for people who've started their companies, who have their companies up and running, who have products and prototype at least, many of whom are on the market. And what we're trying to do is not teach them how to start a company or how to think about changing healthcare. We're trying to say they're already up and running. Let's make sure they get to the market with as much value as possible. That's really what this is all about, is helping good companies become great companies. So again, I'm Paul Grand. I'm the CEO here at MedTech Innovator. This is our 10th year of running MedTech Innovator in the US as well as Asia Pacific. This series that you're listening to now is MedTech Innovator Live for the Asia Pacific program. And we're focused on companies in this program that are looking at the Asia Pacific markets as their primary market. So we're going to be talking about everything from the US to Europe and Asia Pacific today, because we want everybody to think globally. But keep in mind when you're listening to today's broadcast that this is not a 101 how to start a company or 101 tutorial in general. And we're going to try and get into some details about practical advice. So with that, I'm going to direct anyone who's watching this on YouTube, if you have any questions, to put it in the chat box. We'll make sure we get to your questions later at some point during the discussion as best we can. And for those of you here in our cohort, as always, you can put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will make sure to get to your questions as we get to the discussion at the end, the Q&A in the last 30 minutes. So for those of you on YouTube, you got 1 hour, and then we're going to go to our private Q&A afterwards. So with that, let me introduce today's topic, which is clinical trial management in MedTech and working with CROs. And this is something that if you're in the business of healthcare, you're going to be doing some kind of clinical trials. And we have companies from time to time that'll say, oh, we don't need clinical studies to get our approval. And that may be true in some cases, but if you're going to get adoption, you're going to need to do some kind of studies. And whether those are the kinds of studies you need for regulatory approval, whether they're just a market validation study, you're going to need to do some clinical trials. And at some point, it could be retrospective, it could be real world evidence. There's all sorts of different types of trials we're going to talk about. But the point is, you're probably going to be doing clinical trials, and we want to help you with that in terms of thinking about how that's going to work. So today's discussion is going to focus on that. We've got a great expert who's joined us, Chris Rao, who's Senior Vice President, Clinical Development at Alira Health. So let me bring Chris on to introduce himself. Hi, Chris. And if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, about who Alira is and what you guys do there, and specifically what your role is in the clinical development space. So, Chris.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate the introduction. Very happy to be here today. So like Paul was saying, Chris Rao, Senior Vice President of Clinical Development here at Alira Health. So personally, my background is in clinical trials, about 15 years of clinical research, mainly on the operations side, so clinical trial design and management, a number of different indications, both on the pharma biotech side and on the medtech side with medical devices and diagnostics. So these days I do quite a bit of work at Alira with medical device companies, helping companies worldwide to design and implement clinical trials and really to strategize, thinking creatively from an early stage about what things you might need to keep in mind if you're going to have to, as Paul mentioned, run a clinical trial for a variety of reasons, whether it's strictly for regulatory approval, or whether you're, and hopefully you are doing this, is looking to run a clinical trial not only for regulatory approval, but for other means as well, including market adoption. And so just a few notes about Alira Health. I think we were familiar with many of the members of the group, but we are a healthcare advisory, a global healthcare advisory company, and we work across a wide range of activities. Really, the goal of Alira Health is to partner with medtech companies from start to finish So from early design and basically an idea all the way through regulatory work, clinical trial work, and then also some of the more commercial focus activities. So market access, health economics, as well as strategy consulting. We are also a transaction advisory firm. So we help with mergers and acquisitions, as well as licensing agreements worldwide. And we also have a patient engagement and post-market section of the company that works on post-market approvals and patient activities as well, which I think we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about today. So again, we work both with pharma biotech and with medtech companies, and work quite often with Asian companies to help them conceptualize and also bring their ideas to market. So Paul, really happy to be talking to you and the team today, and looking forward to the discussion.
Sorry about that. Yeah, excellent. So thank you, Chris, for that background. And you mentioned already that you do work with people, going all the way from that idea to to the end game. And specifically, I'm just curious: do you spend a lot of time with startups and small companies, or is it mainly with larger companies?
Yeah, we really do. I would say that a large majority of our clients are small startup or early stage medtech companies. I think one of the, Alira Health as a company is about 700 people worldwide. So not a tiny company, but also not one of the largest. So I think one of our focuses, we understand the small company environment, some of the unique challenges that go into both from financially, resource-wise, that medtech companies at that early stage have to deal with. So we do work quite often with startups. I think one of the things too, a startup company often doesn't have a lot of the expertise that they need internally, just by nature of being a young company. So often what we do is we provide that expertise as an adjunct to what you have already internally, because oftentimes, financially, you're just not able to create instantly a 100-person company. You need some of that outside expertise that you can trust.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And, obviously we're partnered with Alira because we think you guys are terrific, and not obviously, as you said, not just in CRO that we're in clinical that we're talking about today, but in strategy broadly, and so many other things. So, thanks again for being such a great partner to us and to our companies globally, not just here in our Asia Pacific program. But let's talk specifically quickly about, you have to get this out of the way, which is like, why work with a CRO versus doing everything in-house? And related to that, when's the right time in a company's development cycle to engage with a CRO? Is it after you finish your product and now you're a design freeze and now it's the time to talk to a CRO, or should you be getting involved earlier?
Yeah, it's a great question. I might turn it around a little bit and say why it's important to work with the right CRO, especially at that early stage. So I think, when you work with a CRO as a medtech company, you really get the benefit of more expertise, again, than you have internally. I think you also get the benefit of working with a group that has expertise with other companies that are similar to yours. So you're basically broadening your knowledge base and you're accessing expertise. It might be a CRO that has worked perhaps even with some competitors, or it's worked with other companies in a similar, even an adjacent field. And so what that CRO should be doing is bringing all of that expertise and adding value to your company and to your program. So with the right partner CRO, they should be providing input to you in addition to you providing input to them in terms of what you want to do. It really should be a back and forth. They should be sometimes asking you hard questions as a med tech company and asking you, have you thought about this? Have you planned for that? I think that's what makes a good CRO partnership. And I think just logistically and realistically, we mentioned too, as a smaller company, you probably don't have the resources to truly engage in a clinical trial just internally. So what you're doing is you're getting access to a broader group of people to help you run that clinical trial. And I think, especially for those who maybe haven't run a clinical trial in the past, or maybe haven't run very many clinical trials, sometimes we tend to underestimate just the people power needed in order to run the trial. So, on the data side, on the monitoring side, on the project management side, there's all different pieces that factor into running the trial. And oftentimes having the CRO partnership gives you access to those needed roles that you wouldn't have internally.
Yeah, no, there's no question you want the best, right? Always on everything, and having people who are experts is certainly the right path, I believe, to doing that. So it makes a lot of sense to me, as I said, which is why we recommend it highly. So then let's get on then to success. What does success look like in a clinical process and in clinical development? How does it's, as you mentioned, and I think I even said a little bit too already, it's not just about regulatory approval. So, how can a well-designed study contribute to market success versus just thinking about it in terms of regulatory approval?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that especially within the medtech field, the clinical trial has sort of been the thing to avoid, or the dirty word, because everyone wants to get regulatory approval without having to generate that clinical data. And like you mentioned at the outset, it is true that often, depending on the nature of your device and your indications for use, you may be able to get that regulatory approval. But like you said, once you have that approval, if no one is interested in using your product, then you're stuck. There's really, why did I go through all the hassle of getting regulatory approval? So what we're constantly working on right from the outset, and I think one of the things to jump back to your previous question about the CRO timing, one of the reasons why we advise to get involved with the CRO at an early stage is because even from a very early conceptual stage, you should be thinking already about what type of data do I need to generate for market adoption? So what do I need for pricing and reimbursement activities? What do I need to engage with the market? Also, what do I need to engage with patients? So if I'm a patient, what is of interest to me when I'm looking at the data that's been collected in the clinical trial? So there's all sorts of components outside of the traditional regulatory clearance that need to be thought of. And I think too, they need to be thought of even at an early stage. A lot of times we see companies that maybe they have to run a clinical trial to get that regulatory approval. So they run the most simple trial possible. It might be a well-run trial, but then they realize that they need to collect additional, maybe health economic data, real world data. They need to collect something else. They may have missed the opportunity to collect all of that as part of their pivotal trial. And now they're running 2, 3, 4 trials in addition because they didn't conceptually think about it at the outset. So we're always thinking about how can we save our clients money? How can we be the most efficient as possible when we're running clinical trial? Can we add secondary endpoints? Can we add additional data collection? Things that might be important beyond just what's required for the regulatory approval.
Yeah, I mean those are some good points that we're already getting into here about thinking through what evidence is going to be needed to be successful in the market and trying to build that in as early as possible. We talk to companies about that all the time because they tend to think in a linear kind of a matter, and they'll say, "Oh, I just need this for approval. Then I'm going to go raise more money, and then we'll do the market validation or something." And we say, "But you could be doing it now. Some of this, like maybe it's possible to do both at the same time." And the problem is, whether it's an investor who says, "Oh, I want to see some of the market evidence." That people are interested in this, they're the health economic data, or a customer that you're trying to land, or something else, and you just don't have that data, and no one will give you more money as an investor until you have it either. They're like, well, you need some customers, and the customer. So as you said, you're kind of dead, and you're like, but I have this approved device, and there is a long line, unfortunately, of approved devices without the required market evidence to be used in any kind of material way. So it's great advice. But I want to get into, something that we do here at MedTech Innovator, which is help people avoid mistakes. So we're already doing a little bit of that with some of the discussion so far. But, when we think about like the mistakes that people are going to make. So as you already laid out one, which is, don't think in a linear way, think in a parallel way for what can we be doing during our pivotal to unlock something later on. What are some other mistakes that, you see small or large companies make in their clinical development, and some tips on avoiding them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number that we could focus on. I think, one of the things we're talking about, perhaps the idea of having a global program. So sometimes I think we tend to think locally when we should be thinking globally right from the outset. So if we're thinking, we have this fantastic product, we may be, say we're in the local Chinese market or the Korean market. Are we thinking about how we can have a global approach, maybe early on engaging with regulatory authorities in the US or in Europe, in addition to, to Chinese FDA? So are we thinking globally? Because often if we're, again, thinking too linearly, we're losing time, and time is money. So if we can think about, okay, what type of data might be interesting in my clinical trial, not only to to FDA or to EMA or to Chinese regulatory authorities. But if we're thinking about a merger of data, then we can start to, be a little bit more efficient in the trials that we have to run. So I think that's, that global picture is really important. I think too, again, and this relates to working with a CRO, is oftentimes, a lot of the companies that we work with, they don't have a local presence in a lot of countries. So their knowledge base is limited to their local geography. So again, engaging with a partner that can give you some insights into the other markets, whether, specifically to clinical trials, things like how do physicians work in another country versus the way they work in your country. So often what we see is, talking about a medical device, standard of care may be very different from one, and often is very different from one country to the other. So as I'm even designing my device, doing usability, am I thinking about the different types of either patients or doctors that might be using my device? Am I factoring that in? Again, taking that global perspective into account. So things like that, it's really important to identify a partner that has a footprint in the countries that you're interested in going to, so that you can get that type of advice. Because if you're lagging behind, that can add months, sometimes a year to your overall timeline if you're struggling to collect that type of information and to design your trials correctly.
Yeah, no, well, you just mentioned footprint in different countries, so in different regions. So let me ask you specifically about Alira. Is that something where you're working in the US and the EU and Asia Pacific, and or only some of those places, and how much experience do you have in the Asia Pacific region? Is that something that Alira does a lot or a little bit? Give me a little flavor for that.
Yeah, no, happy to. It's an interesting point, because I think it speaks to, it doesn't have to be a one size fits all solution. So Alira specifically, in terms of clinical trials, our main teams are in the US and in Europe, and we have a smaller presence in the APAC region. But what we do is we work with preferred partners. So you may find a great CRO, maybe it's Alira, maybe it's someone else, to bring expertise. And I think the advice is, don't be afraid if that CRO is also pulling from different, consultants in different areas. It may not be a CRO that has literally someone in every country, but if it's a CRO that you trust to bring in the right expertise. So for example, oftentimes we work with clients where they may be managing activities in Taiwan, but we're also helping them with US and Europe, and we're running a global program together. So I think it's really more about the partnership that you create, rather than that CRO or that group specifically having to have 100 people in every single country. So the advice would be to be flexible, find a group that you trust, and also a group that's honest with you and not trying to give you every perfect answer. But sometimes if they don't know, they should tell you. And if they maybe recommend another partner, that should be the type of honest relationship that you want with your partners.
Yeah, transparency, honesty, that's everything. So, thanks for that advice. Specifically, when we're thinking about running studies in these different regions, I'm just curious if you had any thoughts on, is it harder to run studies in again, in your experience in the Asia Pacific regions, or any particular countries where it's difficult, or is it easier? Because people ask us all the time, they're like, should I do my clinical work in the US and then go to Asia, or should I do my work in Asia and then come to the US, or do it in Europe and then go? So I'm just kind of curious, do you have any kind of general, I know it's going to be different for different types of devices, but general advice?
Yeah, I mean, I just personally, if I'm working with a client on designing a program, I do really like to take a global approach as early as possible. So often what we're trying to do is if there's interest in the US, but also maybe in China or another country, it's always nice when you can sort of combine the program and perhaps run one multi-center global trial, as opposed to having to do just your trial in the US, get your approval, and then maybe a year or 2 years later, now suddenly running a whole different trial in APAC. So I mean, I think that there's pros and cons. There was a global data report recently that sort of ranked, planned clinical trials in the region. China is very attractive, and I think what we're seeing is more both Western companies and even Chinese companies doing quite a bit of research within the country, and FDA especially being interested in accepting that type of data within reason. So again, if you are an Asian company, it's really important to engage with regulators early on, especially if you're interested in coming to the US or Europe, because FDA especially will give very specific guidance on how much foreign data they're willing to accept as part of an overall regulatory package. So I think there are certainly pros and cons to working in these countries. You have countries like India where it's very attractive to a lot of companies because it tends to be faster startup timelines, much reduced costs. But sometimes what we find is especially within certain indications, sometimes the quality of data from country to country can vary. So it's also really important to work with your partner to get a deep understanding of the quality of the data. I'll give you an example. Personally, a program that we ran at Alira Health, it was in oral medicine, and we ran the program globally. What we found is that the standard of care and the baseline condition of the oral cavity of a lot of patients was very different from country to country. So oral care really varies widely between the US, India, Taiwan, very different baseline. And what we found is that it created a problem with the data because we were not comparing apples to apples, and it became a big challenge. So it's an example, I think, of how you have to be really careful when you are running a multi-country trial, especially in certain indications where standard of care may be different, the patient status might be different. So just something to think about as you're looking to run trials in different countries.
Yeah, no, terrific. And it's a lot to think about. We could spend an entire webinar talking about how to run a multi-country study. But let's try and use the time we have to cover some other things. So, I know you've been in this business for 15 years in this space in clinical research, and things have changed, I'm sure, quite a bit. And maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like there's been a lot of changes in the last several years, maybe due to COVID and other things that have really accelerated some things. And I think just the tech industry in general, has been trying to find ways into the healthcare business. So of course they're coming in and going, where is the inefficiencies and how do we fix that? So I'm seeing all sorts of exciting new technologies, new tools. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, what are some of the key changes that, again, our innovators who are listening here need to be aware of? That have happened, and what should they be thinking about to again improve their odds of success, maybe be more efficient. I know decentralized studies. We have a company called Medable in our portfolio. That's a multi-unicorn at this point, and others because they're enabling new types of clinical studies. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on kind of where we are today, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the future in a bit. But maybe starting off, kind of, what are some of the exciting things and new developments in the field?
Yeah, and you're completely right. I mean, there's a lot of exciting stuff. COVID was definitely a catalyst for a lot of things I think were sort of brewing, but didn't really rise to the surface because there wasn't a widespread push for adoption. I think decentralized clinical trials or hybrid clinical trials is something that everyone's talking about these days. I'd be remiss if I didn't. Alira also has a digital component where we also do decentralized and hybrid trials now as well, both in the US and globally. So it's something that we're very familiar with. And it is really an exciting component of clinical trials. I think it is certainly a buzzword. And I think what we're finding is that during the time of COVID, when everything was decentralized, because you had patients that weren't going to clinics at all, you had major issues with consent and getting people to even participate in the trial just because of the nature of COVID. What we find is things have settled a bit, and now we're looking more at hybrid trials because oftentimes there are indications or different treatment areas where it doesn't make sense to run things completely, from a patient's home or from a decentralized model, but there may be aspects of your trial that you can adapt to the decentralized model. So oftentimes what we find is perhaps you have a program where there's a number of blood draws, maybe there's different assessments, there might be vital signs or walk or gait assessments or all sorts of things that could actually be done in the home, which means that the patient wouldn't have to come in as often to the clinic. So not a truly decentralized trial because it is still hospital or clinic based, but you are able to add components of a hybrid decentralized trial into the program. And that often has a direct effect on enrollment because if we can make the program more accessible for the patient is more likely to enroll. Not only that, it also helps with retention. So if we make the trial more accommodating to the patient's more likely to stay on the trial, especially we do a lot in long-term follow-up. So we have a lot of digital long-term follow-up campaigns. You may have a device that from a regulatory perspective, they're requiring 2, 3, 4 years of follow-up for safety reasons. That patient may not have to come to the hospital for 5 years following the end of the active phase. Maybe we can use a hybrid approach. We're actually assessing them in the home using an app or telemedicine. That's a great example of how we can make these programs better, more accessible for the patient. And I think too, we're also seeing more of a focus on the patient. FDA has really been, I think, leading the charge in terms of patient engagement, but we see it too in the APAC region, I think following suit, where having the patient voice as part of your design is really important. So one of the things we do often with our clients is we actually advise them to create a board of patients within your indication and actually have the patients review your clinical trial protocol. And it doesn't cost a lot, it doesn't take a lot of time, but what you actually find is the patients themselves are very interested in commenting on the protocol and the design. We think from a scientific perspective, does a patient really care about an endpoint, or do they really care about the schedule of assessments or what we're doing? But we find that they actually do, and they're really engaged in their own health. And so often we're modifying our protocols or the type of data we're collecting based on what's of interest to the patient. Obviously, also taking into account scientifically and what the physicians are saying and what your company is saying, but having the patient as part of the overall development process, I think, leads to more meaningful data. And again, we're talking about market adoption. Patients design programs that they like. So I think it leads to better market adoption down the road when you actually do go to market.
Wow.
So those are two exciting things I think we're seeing now. Yeah.
Yeah, super exciting. And and I know patient engagement is a hot topic in general. And as you said, it's something that people don't do often enough. I love the idea of creating a patient board and having them review things, all the way through. I mean, people certainly, I think, are thinking about the caregiver, perhaps, and what their, the user experience is. But, as you said, it's the patient ultimately who's, the recipient of all this, and they have thoughts on things. And obviously, the diabetes community is incredibly engaged already. They have been for years. But what about some of these, can you build a patient board in any indication? Is that hard to do? Like, I mean, I'm just kind of curious quickly, like, how do you even go about doing that? Is that like a Facebook ad campaign? Like, how do you find these people?
Yeah, no, really interesting question. I mean, it's I think a varied approach. So it really depends on the type of patient that you're looking for. A lot of times at Alira, we work with rare disease patients. So oftentimes we're talking to patient associations. Even if they're small groups, a lot of times we can, because you don't need a huge number of patients for the board. You just need representative patients, perhaps from different areas or different, age groups or demographics. So we do that, but we also do, things like Facebook advertising, Google ads. There's a lot of technology components that you can bring into play to be able to pull into the patients into that type of a scenario. So I think it's really it's a different approach. And again, if you're working with a patient engagement group that's advising you, they should have a lot of flexibility. It's not just a one size fits all, especially depending on the age or the type of patient you're looking for.
Yeah, and you mentioned before, again, like the hybrid world we're in now, and I guess the same thing applies to engaging patients. You don't have to necessarily fly them in and bring them into to a center, do you, or do you engage them mainly digitally?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because I'm a big fan of face-to-face interactions, even especially coming out of COVID. I think that sometimes you do miss something without the face-to-face. At the same time, just given the speed that we're trying to work at, we may also be running a patient advisory board in multiple countries. We do usually find that a virtual patient advisory board is best because it helps you to minimize costs from the company level, but also the patients, especially if they're actively ill patients, if it's a rare disease or maybe they're under the care of a caregiver. I think the virtual option is just a better option when you're running these types of things. It's super easy to do. I think at this point, everyone is using Zoom or Microsoft Teams or similar technology. So we also find that the patients are open to it because everyone's using these types of technology, just like we're doing right now. So virtual tends to be best, but certainly with the option to do an in-person, if there's a need or an interest from our clients.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in this, so I'm just going to ask one more question about it, and then let's move on. But in terms of that, those patient boards, just to give people kind of a sense, are we talking about like 5 people, 50 people? It's not, you're not trying to sample thousands of people, I imagine. So what does a patient board look like?
Yeah, no, you hit it right on the head. I think usually it's 5 to 7 people, and we've done them differently. Sometimes what you're looking to do is to get everyone together to sort of have the dialogue, but other times what you're looking to do is actually have an individual interview with each of the patients separately, and then to combine the feedback into one advisory report to our clients. So what we'll usually do is we'll collect all of the feedback, we'll analyze, we'll compare one patient to another, try to find a common ground or a common theme between what we're hearing from the patient. And then we'll provide a really detailed report to the client. And we get great feedback on these reports because a lot of times we're, as developers of the device, we're not the patient. So sometimes it's completely new information that we may not have received before as the developer of a device or a diagnostic. And it's really meaningful because it helps drive maybe it helps drive a different iteration of the device. Maybe it helps drive, more usability testing. So there's all sorts of things that gets driven by these reports that we give to our clients. I think it's, super meaningful. I also it's fascinating to me too, because I think for so long we've ignored the voice of the patient to some extent as, as scientists and as developers. And MedTech has lagged a little bit behind biotech and pharma when it comes to patient engagement, but we are seeing more of a focus on it, which is really exciting for MedTech. So it's a really exciting page that we're turning.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad to hear it. And I agree with you completely. A lot of the innovations that we've seen in the biopharma space are definitely making their way over to MedTech now, which is really encouraging because it has lagged. And, pharma, is had for years this compliance and, having people have to adhere to taking a medication perhaps for a long term, whereas devices, and historically maybe were acute in many cases, but now we get all this chronic technology that people are using and all sorts of things. And of course, digital health, which falls under kind of this global device kind of space in terms of regulation. So, I think, it makes a lot of sense that, we're not just thinking about patients in the short term, like, oh, they're in the hospital for 5 days and whatever. We're thinking about them as, in the long term in the medtech industry, which is great. Something I'm going to change gears here for now and talk a little bit about funding. And by the way, something I know a lot of people don't know is that Alira does invest in companies. We're not going to get too much into that side of things right now because I want to stick to clinical trials. But I did want to put that out there for people who are watching and listening, that Alira does make investments and they've invested in companies of our portfolio, and I know the feedback has been great. But I want to talk about the funding of clinical studies. And I mentioned this earlier, how oftentimes investors and others will they'll fund a particular plan, and then if someone comes back later and says, oh, we need more data, oftentimes, the investors are going, hey, I funded what we said we were going to fund and we're done. And, you should have figured that out. So, which leads to the strategist, really thinking this through at your end. But I know that there's also, besides just the classic equity investors, there's other ways to fund clinical studies. In the US, NIH will fund certain things, and there's lots of other people. You mentioned patient organizations. So I'm just curious, are there some innovative ways to fund clinical trials that people don't necessarily think about? What are some thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we look at it a couple of different ways when we think about funding. So, the clinical trial is probably one of your biggest expenditures within your overall development program, if not the biggest expenditure. So I think we try to be as creative as possible with the understanding that it is going to be a major investment. So to some extent, you do just have to be prepared to for that expenditure. But there's lots of other things you can do. I mean, one of the things a lot of times we do with our clients is we think about, in the context of a clinical trial, if I need to generate data to trigger additional investment, is it possible for me to design a trial where perhaps I do a data cut or a data review even halfway through the trial, and then I can use that data to then go out for further investment? So for some companies, and it can be a little bit scary because you are basically going at risk within the trial. Maybe you don't have the full amount to run the trial from start to finish. But if you're fairly confident in the data you're going to collect, then that data can be used even before the trial is over for additional investment. Another thing that we do at Alira internally, we have a platform. We made an acquisition of a company earlier this year called CRO. It's an equity crowdfunding platform that we use both for MedTech and for biotech. But also the whole crowdfunding idea is building steam, especially in the US. So that's a platform that's based in the US, but it's open to international companies as well. And basically what it's a way to build publicity for your company and to take in crowd investment. And that can that can be just enough to get you started on your clinical pathway while you're waiting for a larger investment, or in some cases, you actually can, you can get those large investments even through that crowdfunding platform. So that's an interesting way to look at, a novel way to get funding. I think when it comes to, I think the question we get sometimes as a CRO is, as a CRO, are we willing to put equity into the program rather than, are we willing to take equity rather than payment for managing the trial? And usually we don't work in that model. I think sometimes for us, we would rather, separate that, having that equity in the program to make sure that we're running the trial fairly without any conflict of interest. So there are some CROs that, that will do that, and that's definitely an option. We don't tend to do that as a Lyra, but what we do try to do is be very fair and transparent in pricing. And then also sometimes perhaps we can separate out the activities so that some activities can be performed and maybe other activities, can wait until later. So, for example, sometimes a company may just want to do site feasibility. They may just want to look at potential physicians and clinics to run the trial without actually starting the trial. So if we can break out that component, and this is something to ask of your partners, can you break out components so we can do things in pieces based on the funding that we have? So that's another option as well, just getting creative with how much you're spending and when you're spending it.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I'm thinking about specifically about, are there organizations like, and types of maybe categories, as I said, I mentioned patient organizations before. I don't know if the, do the patient societies or patient organizations, do they fund clinical trials? Like, do they help, advance some of this, or or maybe, in some cases, I know there's been hospital systems that say, hey, this technology would benefit our patients and we'll help, we'll run the study, let's say, but we won't charge to do so. And then we want to be able to publish or other things. I'm just curious, are there, am I hitting, the nail on the head there? Are there other, are these things just really more outliers, or is that kind of stuff pretty common?
No, definitely. So I always advise people to do your homework, especially when it comes to the grants that might be available. So I think you mentioned, there's a lot of times federal grants here in the US. You have NIH or NCI in oncology, where there's oftentimes a lot of grant opportunities. We always give a bit of a caution there, is that a lot of times everyone is going after that same pool of grant money. So it can be a really competitive environment. So I think what we find too is within MedTech, we advise, don't put everything into one grant, all your expectations into one grant application, because then if it doesn't follow through, then you could be in a difficult position. So grants are a great way to get that type of non-dilutive funding. Also, like you mentioned, patient organizations may have their own pool of money that they can give in terms of grants. And I think doing your research. So aside from federal money, there's private money that can be made available, private organizations. And like you said, too, a lot of times looking to investigator-led studies. So like you said, there might be a physician who's really interested in your technology and is willing to run the trial for free at his or her institution. I think the caution that I usually give about investigator-led trials, so basically you're not the sponsor as a company, it's really the physician who's leading the trial, is sometimes there can be issues with access to the data. So be very careful of who owns the data that the physician is collecting. Is it owned by the institution, by the hospital? Do you have rights to the data? So there's a lot of contractual things go into that. So if you're designing a clinical program, it's really attractive because it's an inexpensive way to see your device in action in the clinic, but just be really cognizant of how the data will be collected and who owns it, and will who has publication rights, who has access to that data. There's just lots of little nuances that go into those types of programs, but they can be a really great way to run a clinical trial very inexpensively, like you said.
Yeah, no, great advice. I was just thinking about something again, as it relates to working with CROs. And that is, oftentimes people don't really know what questions to ask when they're starting these relationships. And, and we've talked a little bit about some things. You said something earlier where you're like, that's a good question to ask your partner. And so, I'm just wondering, what are some of the things that, someone should be asking that, if they're talking to a CRO, maybe for the first, or interviewing some CROs, and they're trying to assess whether or not this is going to be a good partner for them. What are some of the questions that maybe, if we flip this around, what should they be? What are some of the things they should be asking their partner or their potential partners? And again, not an exhaustive list, but what are some of the general things if I'm evaluating a couple different potential CROs, what might I ask?
Yeah, I'll try to think of some of the the really tough questions that we get asked sometimes of our clients, especially in the early stage when you're getting to know each other and during the proposal process. Obviously experience within the field is really important, but I think not only experience, because that's, as a metric, it's important, but I think also maybe experience, a lot of times we talk to our clients about, how have we worked with other APAC companies previously? Especially, if you're working in a different geography, understanding how they're going to work with you on a weekly basis, how they're going to manage time zone differences, how they're going to be your representative, perhaps in a country where you don't have any employees. I think those are all really important things. They're more of the soft metrics versus the hard metrics of, how many studies have you done in the past 5 years, and, who do you know? But I think it's important to also get a sense on the relationship side of how they're willing to build a relationship with you. A lot of times we work with companies. I could think of a couple of companies we're working with right now in the APAC region who had a bad experience with a partner because they just didn't feel well represented by their partner. So a lot of times with some of these larger, CROs or larger companies, we find that you're just one of many programs, and they just are sort of following a checklist. They're running the clinical trial the way that they run every other trial, and there's not really a lot of room for creativity or really working hand in hand as a partner. So it's something that that I always recommend you kind of investigate that relationship side of things. Another thing too is, who would your partner propose that they work with? So if you're running maybe a medical device trial in oncology, what are the centers that they like to work with? What are the relationships that they have with oncology centers, whether it's in China or Korea or even US or Europe? Who are their partners? Because you might have a great potential partner, but if they don't have good connections with the physicians and with the project teams at the institutions that you're going to be running the trial at, that can become an issue because it gives them very little power to influence the outcome of the trial in a positive manner. So I think those are some basic things. More on the budget side, the partner should be really transparent on the budget. So you should be, if you're getting a budget or a proposal for a clinical trial, you really should be able to understand every piece of that budget. If there's something that doesn't seem clear, or perhaps some of the assumptions that they used are not clear or even hidden, that's probably a warning sign. And they should be willing to walk step by step each component of that budget with you until you understand it completely. And it should make sense to you as the client. And maybe there's things that you don't understand at first, just because maybe you haven't run a clinical trial before. But I think the willingness of your partner to explain, to be transparent, and to walk through everything also will show you how they're going to maintain that relationship, all the way to the end of the trial. So I think that's on the budget side. It's another really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, I know we had last week we talked about supply chain. We had a whole discussion, with Jabel talking about how they go about, establishing resiliency and some other things in the supply chain. And one of the things that they advised, they said, look, we like to talk to people early, really early, call us. We're going to give you feedback. It's not going to cost you anything to have some of these initial conversations. Please reach out to us early. Do you have that same kind of advice? Do you want people to call? I mean, we talked about how early you get involved, but I'm saying, do you have that same kind of relationship where people can call you and just, talk generally about what they're doing, and you're not going to design their study for them perhaps, but, do you advise people to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll take an initial call or even a second call with a new potential client, and we'll just spend an hour just brainstorming with them on the phone or over Zoom or Teams. We'll try to bring maybe our chief medical officer or one of our biostatisticians. And like you said, it's not really, we're not designing your study, but we're just getting you thinking about some of the things that maybe we could do together just to share our experience. Also, at the same time, we're kind of all in this together as potential partners. So why not share a little bit of helpful advice? So even in an hour, just taking a quick look at maybe if it's a protocol synopsis or a quick just some thoughts around study design, study outline. a lot of times we can start to brainstorm together and to think about what direction we might want to go in. And even at the super early stage, maybe maybe you don't even have a study design yet, but we can start to think about, okay, what type of patient might you be looking for? Maybe we can make a recommendation on, a physician investigator who might be a great resource for you, a key opinion leader, maybe that we could connect you to. So I think it's little things like that that kind of start to build a relationship. And at the end of the day, even if we don't end up working together formally, we're happy to kind of give those pieces of advice to, to potential clients. So I think any group you work with should have that type of approach, because that's the useful information you need right off the bat.
That's great. I'm glad you guys do that. And in our experience, I know that many of our companies have that kind of a long relationship in some cases with Alira, not just on CRO, but in general, in terms of like business strategy, where you might be talking to them for a year or maybe even longer before they eventually become a client. So thank you for that. You mentioned KOLs. I get two big questions at MedTech Innovator from our portfolio companies. Number one is, can you introduce me to an investor, or which not can you? Here's a fun fact. We have over 2,500 investors who've invested in our portfolio. There's a lot of people out there who invest in this space. And so people always say to me, who should I talk to? Who would be some good investors for us? That's number one. Number two is KOLs. People say, can you introduce me to KOLs? Can you introduce me to we're doing a clinical trial and we're trying to expand, beyond this, this initial local site and some others. Who else should we be talking to? And they ask me, or they ask other people in our cohort. They'll say, we're like, we had a meeting not too long ago with a bunch of our companies, and someone said, oh, I have we're doing this lung cancer study, and we're looking for a CRO who has very specific expertise or even has their own, has a model, for lung cancer that they have expertise with, so pretty nuanced. And so my question for you is a little bit of like, how do people go about, what's kind of the process for selecting KOLs? What kind of makes for a good, not just a KOL, but a good investigator? What is a healthy relationship? And, is it just going for someone who's the big person that, is, you've seen their name everywhere, or is there another strategy? So I'm just a little curious about that.
Yeah, I love this question. It's super nuanced, because if you put 10 KOLs in a room, then you have 10 different attitudes and 10 different opinions, and they'll probably all fight with each other. So it is really difficult. I think one of the big things when you're choosing a key opinion leader is, again, I love data and I love metrics, but also the soft skills, because you have to work with a KOL who, yes, is well published, understands the indication, understands the patient population, but that person also does have to be able to work well with others, because they're going to be interacting with the other physicians that you're working with, where you're running your trial. They're going to be providing medical and scientific input. So if you're working with a KOL that tends to be very strict in their interpretation of everything, maybe they don't have any room for considering other opinions, it can actually be a problem. You can actually alienate some of your other physicians, maybe some, there's multiple KOLs in every indication. So I always, advise, be really careful and make sure it's someone that you trust, someone who does understand, is well published, but also that, will be able to help guide you, but not be open to other opinions. Because even in the course of a clinical investigation, your understanding of your own product may change. Over the course of the years, the patient population may change, standard of care may change. So if you're working with someone that's a bit, too sometimes so far along in their career that they're just not open to anything new, you can find yourself in a difficult situation. And again, as a CRO, we try to align ourselves with doctors and scientists that have a similar philosophy to us, and that are also flexible, but also very well respected. So we also make recommendations about KOLs all the time to our clients. We try to make good introductions to people that we think will really help the company. So rely on your partners too. If you're working with a good CRO or a good advisory group that knows the indication, more often than not, they'll be able to make a good recommendation, or even a couple of different recommendations to people that you might want to work with. But yeah, it can be really tricky, for sure.
Yeah. For sure. So we only have about 5 minutes left in the public broadcast part of this. So what I want to do is just cover maybe like one major last topic, and then in a minor way, and then kind of wrap up. One last thing. We only really briefly talked about it, but what are some of the things that are coming, or that are here now, and that we talked about real world evidence and some of these other digital technologies. Again, like what are, when we're thinking about study design, from a long-term holistic perspective, what are some things that, people need to be aware of if they're not, or, that are more, as we said, this is, broader thinking than just, I need to get this thing approved. And so what are kind of some of those other, newer things that people are doing and that you should be thinking about? And should everybody be thinking about real world evidence and other things? So just, quickly, some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to probably need another hour, but I'll try to keep it keep it pretty brief. I think, yeah, I mean, data collected in the real world setting is gold. But what, something to keep in mind as a company that's looking into clinical trials and the real world data collection is that data is only as good as the way it's collected and the uniformity of the data. So a lot of times we have data that's out there in the real world setting, but it's, it maybe is not well collected. It's not consistently collected. And so you're not able to really have a unified data set. So think about, as a company that maybe has a medical device product, you can think about, how do I design perhaps a good registry? So if I have regulatory approval, can I design a registry that's well designed, well defined? The data is collected in a consistent way across multiple institutions. And now I'm starting to really build a pool of real data that I can use. Maybe I can use that to support a new indication from a regulatory perspective. Maybe I can use it for additional reimbursement. There's all sorts of things we can do. The problem is that the data, if the data is dirty or it's not well collected, that's not going to convince a regulatory body or a payer to do what you want them to do. So I think real world data is a great topic, but there's lots of nuances there that maybe we don't always think about. The other thing I think is really important is also we're hearing a lot, especially in the US, about diversity in clinical trials. So how am I able to make my product available to patients in areas where perhaps medical care isn't as available? And I think in the APAC region, this is also a conversation. So that's another interesting thing, and the regulators are really interested, and payers are as well. How are we creating a diverse patient population even in our clinical trial? So maybe another webinar topic down the road. I think those are two kind of exciting things that we're focused on more and more these days.
Yeah, great advice. As you said, the whole diversity in clinical trials thing is huge. And even being able to, as you said, I think, or alluding to a little bit before, is, being able to use that data for other things. You said new indications, maybe new markets, being able to say, hey, we've got this in the US, and maybe with the data we have, we can go to the EU, maybe we can go to other markets, or with a registry, we can set it up. And obviously you've got to work with your partner. I guess to your point about having good data, you need someone to help you design the way to collect that data in a uniform way so that you can actually do something with it. So that's just such great advice. So I really appreciate everything you've shared today, Chris. I wish we did have one more hour in our public broadcast here, because we'd keep going on this. But for those, we're going to have 30 minutes with our cohort companies to answer their questions privately. But for those people who are out there who would love to follow up with you, and I'm sure there's a lot. How do they find you? Are you on LinkedIn? Like, what's the best way to find you? Email? How do you like to be contacted, Chris?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Please feel free to reach out. Email direct. It's chris.rao@alirahealth.com. Always happy to take questions, to continue the conversation. Like we said, it's very collaborative the way we work at Alira Health. So if we can help advise and potentially work together down the road, happy to have anyone reach out.
Terrific. And Rao, RAO, for those who are wondering how to spell that. And just in general, any last thought you want to share? And we've been talking for an hour. So is there any kind of closing comment or something that you want to give people on advice? This is it. This is the last thing you can. You only have one more minute.
No pressure. No pressure.
No.
I mean, I think it's a really exciting time for MedTech. I think there's a ton of huge advances happening. So when it comes to clinical trials, I think there's, the sky is the limit right now in terms of what you're able to do. So, be creative, think proactively, and start thinking early about the types of clinical trials that you want to run with a good partner.
Terrific. Well, listen, Chris, we've, as I said, we've introduced all sorts of topics that make me want to have another clinical design webinar. Next week, we're going to be talking about regulatory, which goes hand in hand with clinical development. So I'm glad we did this one first, because now it's got me and I think others thinking about some of the regulatory considerations. And thank gosh we didn't try and target that today, get into that today, because there's a lot more there. So again, thank you, Chris, for all the time today and all the insights you shared. I think you definitely educated me as well as a lot of other people. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Paul. It was great talking to you.
Yeah. All right. So you stick around, Chris. I'm going to say goodbye to the YouTube audience here. So for those of you who are out there watching this on YouTube, we appreciate your taking some time to listen, hopefully, and watch. Hopefully this was useful. We have this series of webinars that run throughout our accelerator program, and we open it up so that anybody on the outside can come listen and can come watch. So we're glad you're doing that. You can go to medtechinnovator.org/APAC live, and that will give you the schedule for all of our webinars. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about regulatory next week. We also have medtechinnovator.org/live, which is our US focused program. So if you're interested in just the US market, we have a whole series just for you on that. And we even have one on biotools as well. So just go to our website, you'll find the links to all those. And of course, on YouTube, if you get to our YouTube channel, you'll find archives of all of these webinars from this year as well as from prior years. So we thank you for joining us. We're going to end the YouTube live stream, and then we're going to go over to our cohort for Q&A. So thanks again for